recording. All right, here we go. It's all yours.
Okay, we having is everybody here or that we think is going to be here?
You can go ahead and start right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's go over a brief review of what we've done in the last few weeks. We hang on a second, let me move my video over so I can see myself. It doesn't want to let me, there we go. Good. Okay, so so far we have talked about how blind faith is a bad idea, how rational faith is the only good option, and how all religions are only the same, and how all other religions require blind faith except for Christianity. Christianity is the only religion that condemns blind faith. So the first apologetic proof we provided was using science to prove that it's more rational to believe that God exists. And that's what we did the second week. Okay, so now that it's rational to believe in God, that doesn't mean Christianity is true. Remember, there could be multiple different gods. So the next thing we want to prove is that the Bible is what the original authors wrote, because if we can focus on Christianity and prove Christianity is true, then we're in a sense are disproving all the other gods as false, right? So that's what we did this third week. That's what we did last week. Okay, so last week we proved the Bible is what the original authors wrote, but that does not mean it's true. I mean, we showed a lot of evidence that shows it was true, but maybe they made up the part about Jesus. So the third apologetic, is the one we're going to do today, is proof that the Bible is true because, and it is rational and reasonable to believe Jesus rose from the dead. And that's what we're going to cover today. And then next week, we'll do what use was it for Christ to die? Why couldn't God just wave his hand and forgive us all? And so next week, we'll talk about why Christ had to die and why God must punish sin. And at that point, we're moving away from apologetics to theology. And I'll explain what that is next week. Okay. And then the fifth one is the most common objection. The fifth apologetic is, how can God exist when there's so much evil and suffering in the world? Or where was God when I was in pain? And so we'll talk about that. Now, later on, if we ever can continue this series, although we're going to end at that fifth apologetic, unless people want to continue, we talk about how to use that, and that is how to talk about others without feeling awkward or getting in trouble. Okay, so back to what we studied all the options, and all the options are, that was for week one, is there is no God or there are one or more gods. Well, with week one, we proved that there are at least one or more gods. Well, actually, we proved that there's only one God because you can't have more than one all-powerful being. So really, there's only one God. So if there's one God, then we have four options. One, Islam is true, Judaism is true, or Christianity is true, or it's an unknown God, right? It could be that we haven't discovered the God, so there's one more unknown God. Or it could be another religion that's monotheistic, like Sikhism or something like that. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to focus on Christianity and Judaism, because they're combined together into actually one thing, because Christianity is based on the Bible of the Jews, or the Bible of Israel, which is Judaism. Okay, so let's talk about the Bible now. So first of all, let me ask you a question. What was the first time that the gospel was hinted at in the Bible, in the Old and New Testament? The very first time you hear the hint of the gospel. Anybody know that? Just think through that and see if you guessed this one. Hopefully some of you guessed that the first time it was in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis. Where in Genesis 3:15, God says, I will put enmity, that is a war between you and the women, between your offspring and her offspring. Right? He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. So today's talk is the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I want to start by giving you a brief background. Many years ago, I was fortunate enough to have to fly to Israel to help some customers design one of the very first MPEG encoders. Most of you don't know this, but I and a friend of mine designed the very first MP3 player in 1989. We were were working for LSI Logic, and so we designed it. It was part of our job, so we didn't get rich on it, but LSI Logic sold a lot of those chips, made a lot of money. I then got a job. I was hired, recruited by a company called C-Cube that did some of the very first MPEG video players, MP4 players, if you will. And so we designed chips, and my job was to help people design these chips into systems. And I helped Samsung develop the very first DVD player based on these video decoders. Anyway, so there was a company in Israel that wanted to do an MPEG encoder, and so they asked me to fly out there. And so I flew out to Jerusalem, actually to Tel Aviv, to show them how to use our chip. Now, when I got in Tel Aviv was, I have to say it, but I thought that was a very ugly country, ugly city. All the buildings were concrete, they were very modern, they were very ugly. And I knew that I wanted to go to Jerusalem, but we were working in this lab just outside Tel Aviv in Holon. And every day we'd be working long hours, and then I'd go back to the hotel and I'd look at my map in the hotel. They had a map of Jerusalem, and I would look at the map and they would say, wow. And I would look at the map and say, I'd see, oh, wow, Jerusalem, man, that's halfway across the country. I need to figure out a way to get to Jerusalem. So one day at work, while I was working with the guy there, his name was Asher. And I said, hey, Asher, I really want to go to see Jerusalem. I've been here almost 4 days, and I haven't had a chance to do any sightseeing. I would love to go see Jerusalem. He says, oh, I wish you had told me that before. Why don't we go there for dinner? And I said, dinner? That's halfway across the country. He goes, yeah. It's about 45 minutes of traffic, maybe an hour. I'm like, what? It turns out the whole country is only about 30 miles wide. And when we got to Jerusalem, it was a beautiful city. Everything was made of stone, no concrete anywhere. It was just one of the nicest old-fashioned cities I've ever seen. Really pretty, perfect temperature. We were in the middle of the summer. Temperature was perfect. It was like 70 degrees. It was really pretty. And the city itself, I noticed, was very small. In fact, the entire city of Jerusalem, the internal city of Jerusalem, is less than 3/4 of a mile wide. I mean, you can walk from one end of Jerusalem to the other end of Jerusalem in about 8 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes. And in Jesus' time, it was even smaller because the city wall in Jesus' time was right there where you see that red line. Well, I finally got some time. We were right there around Yom Kippur. I think it was September, right there around Yom Kippur. And so there was a festival. Yom Kippur was coming up. And Yom means day and Kippur means atonement. So the company I was working with said, hey, we've arranged for a private tour of Israel with you, and we've hired a private driver. So I had my own personal chauffeur, and he was a tour guide too. So he drove me throughout. We drove up to Nazareth, we drove to Jerusalem, we did a full tour of Jerusalem, and it was very luxurious, to say the least, because the company was paying for all of it, and they covered all my meals and everything. It was great. But when we got to Jerusalem, one of the places that the tour guide took me to was a place where there was a big mound it was right here outside the city. There was a big mound there, and they had the yarmulkes on their head, and they were kind of praying there. They weren't praying to it, but they were praying there. So I turned to the tour guide and I said, what is this place? And why are we here? He said, oh, this is the tomb of David. Right? So it's David's tomb in Jerusalem. Now, it's the traditional spot where David is buried, but we don't know all the details about it. But that's a common place. And when I was there on Yom Kippur, there were a lot of tourists there, a lot of Jewish tourists there, because if you live outside Jerusalem and you come visit, you're going to go to the tomb of David because it's one of the places you want to see. Okay, now I was born in Ghana, if you remember, and my dad was a scientist, a professor in physics. And so even though he was an atheist at first, became a Christian, as I told you, I grew up in Jamaica, Ethiopia, Sudan, Yemen, and India, and I was surrounded by Muslims, Hindus, Jains, Sikhs, Zoroastrians, Buddhists. And I would ask myself, why am I a Christian? After all, most of my friends were Muslims or Hindu, and my dad was an atheist until I was 5. But one of the questions I would ask myself is like, if I died, where would I go? And I would notice that, because I'd been to a few funerals, and I would ask myself, is this all there is to life? Is death the end game? Because I didn't want to believe in some convenient fantasy. I'm a scientist. I want evidence. I want to know if what I believe is true. And so the question that kept coming up is death the end game? Is that the end of our lives? And yeah, of course, the Bible says that we have heaven to look forward to in the new earth. But is that just a convenient fantasy? Is that something that people made up because they were afraid of death? They didn't want to face death. So I started studying apologetics, and the background of apologetics. I've told you that. It's 1 Peter 3:15. Always be prepared to give an apologia to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hopes you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. And the word apologia, we've said, means defense or explanation. And to remind you, apologetics is the evidence and defense of the rational faith of Christianity using facts, logic, history, science, philosophy, and reasoning, right? And so my question is, what is the defense of Christianity? And does that prove that Christianity is true, so I can be sure that death is not the end game? And of course, I always like to say, remember, it says always be prepared. That is not, sometimes be prepared, that's not. Maybe you should be prepared, and that means always and for everyone. So that's not a suggestion, that's a direct commandment. Just like going to all the world and preach the gospel. Always be prepared to go into all the world and preach the gospel with a defense for it, not just with evangelization. So I started all this with that. I ended up starting my ministry called No Blind Faith. And as you've known in the last few days, we've talked about how Christianity isn't a blind faith. It's a rational faith built on a solid historical and logical foundation, right? And I'll talk about, I've already talked about these steps, so I'm not going to cover these right now, but I'll just go through them. These are the 6 steps that we are going to cover in here in this class. I'm so group now. So using apologetics, though, in the last few weeks, we've already established a number of things. What have we established? We've established that that blind faith is dangerous. We've established that an all-powerful being called God exists, and we use science for that. We've established that the supernatural exists. Remember, in the Agent X talk, we talk about the multidimensions, how the supernatural exists. And so today we're going to prove that the Bible is transmitted accurately, correctly. And then last week we proved that the Bible is transmitted correctly and is accurate, right? So by the way, just a little promo here. This is the Daily Apologetics for Kids from 6 through 11 that you can get on Amazon. So one of the things that we notice is that Christianity is based not only on the teachings of Jesus, but on the blood of Jesus, right? It's not, Christianity is not like every other religion. And the reason I say that is because if we had no Jesus, if there was no blood, there would be no redemption of sin. If there is no redemption of sin, there is no salvation. If there's no salvation, there's no Christianity. In that case, all Christianity would be as a social gathering, right? So if you look at any other religion, like if Buddha never existed, that's okay as long as we have his teachings, right? If Muhammad never existed, that's okay as long as we have the Quran. If Joseph Smith never really existed, but we have the Book of Mormon, theoretically, you'd still have Mormonism. I argue you don't, but because he added a lot of stuff to it. But unlike all those religions, even in Hinduism, there was no Krishna. In fact, a lot of people believe there was no Krishna, but it's the teaching of Hinduism that they believe in. But unlike Hinduism and Jainism and all those other religions, if you take away Christ, you have no religion. If you take away Christ, you have no faith, you have no hope, you have no salvation, you have nothing. Now, here's the question I asked. Did Jesus come to show us the way to God? And the answer is no. He didn't come as to show us the way to God. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He came to be the way to God, right? He is the way to God. He's the only way to God. And as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:12, that if there is no resurrection of the dead, if Christ did not rise from the dead, then if we are our faith is in vain, and we of all people are to be pitied. Right?
Yeah.
So this is the question that we have in front of us. Did Christ rise from the dead? And if you don't believe in Jesus, if you don't believe in the resurrection, if you don't believe in Christianity, if you're not a Christian, then I'm going to give you a challenge. If I were able to prove to you that Jesus Christ was a real human being and he was crucified, died, and rose from the dead, claiming he was God, would you consider becoming a Christian? Because that's the best proof there is, right? Okay, so today we're going to talk about a number of things. This is our agenda. One, why is Jesus different from the other good teachers? That's number one. Two, did Jesus really exist? Three, did he really rise from the dead? Okay, well, let's look at the first one, which we kind of already covered. All right, why is Jesus different from the other good Jesus? Because Jesus claimed to be God and he claimed to prove it by rising from the dead. Jesus Christ, unlike all the other teachers and starters of the religion, didn't come to show the way, but to be the way. And as I mentioned, without Muhammad, you have Islam, without Christianity, you have Hinduism. Without Jesus, you don't have Christianity. So we already covered that one, right? So let's look at the second one. Did Jesus really exist? Well, here is a historian named Cornelius Tacitus, right? A lot of people say Tacitus, but in Latin, the C is pronounced as a K. So, and he says, he's a historian. He was also in the Senate, in the Roman Senate, and he writes this. He says, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, meaning Christianity, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. Right? Flavius Josephus was not a Christian, so Tacitus was not a Christian. Flavius Josephus was not a Christian. He was actually a Jew who defected and became a Roman citizen and a Roman historian, but he was asked by Trajan to write a history, actually not by Vespasian, to write a history from the Jews' perspective about the Roman Jewish wars. And he does a very good job about that. But in his histories, he writes this. He says, Ananias, the high priest, convened a meeting of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, a brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. So right there, we have two non-Christians. In fact, they probably hated Christianity. Two non-Christians saying not only that Jesus was a real human being, but he had a brother named James who was killed by the Sanhedrin by being stoned. Okay, so you can see right now we have evidence that Jesus really exists. In fact, it turns out there is more independent sources about Jesus' existence than there is of Caesar's existence. Interestingly enough, if you just count the sources, right? And those are non-Christian sources. I'm not talking about the thousands of Bible fragments. I'm talking about non-Christian sources, independent, individual sources. Why? Because now if you start counting them up, you'll see that Jesus is mentioned by Suetonius, Pliny Secundus, Thales, and the Talmud. Okay? And we talked about Pliny last week. He was the historian Pliny the second. He's the one who documented about Christians praying to Jesus as to a God, right? So we see all this without once touching the Bible. We prove that not only did Jesus exist, but he was crucified by Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and there are people running around saying that he was the Messiah. And that's exactly what the Bible has been saying for the last 2,000 years. So now we come to the really rise from the dead. And this is, the real crux of this message, was Jesus God? Maybe you've lost someone close, perhaps you fear death like I did. Where do you find your hope? Is the grave our final destiny? One atheist argument against God is if God is there, why do babies die? Why do children die? Why are innocent people killed in tornadoes of war? They say this is proof that God cannot exist. And we'll talk about this later on, because that's a key question. If God exists, why doesn't he stop evil? But evil exists. Did Jesus rise from the dead? And is death our final destiny? Is death the victor in the end? Is death the end game? The end of life, the end of love, the end of hope? Is death so complete and the grave an impossible potion to beat? See, Paul says if there is no resurrection of the dead, and if Christ did not rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain, and we of all people are to be pitied. So the question comes back to, did Jesus rise from the dead, or is this just a convenient fantasy so we can sleep our night and we can tell our kids, don't be afraid of death? Well, Jesus claimed to be God, But anyone can claim to be God. I mean, other people claim to be God. Why should I believe that Jesus really is God? Right? Why should I believe that I not be scared of death? Why should I believe in the resurrection of death and eternal life? If Jesus proved he was God, I can believe in all that. And the way he proved he was God is something happened 2,000 years that changed 2,000 years ago that changed the entire course of history. Some inexplicable occurrence occurred, and mankind has never been the same since. It's a line that's drawn through history. It's a mystery that changed history. Something so unusual happened that it motivated a handful of scared fishermen to leave everything that was familiar to them and go out to the most dangerous corners of the world and change the entire world. And one of them even came to India and converted my ancestors, right? St. Thomas. The mystery that changed history is the mystery of the empty grave.
Yeah.
You see, 2,000 years ago, there was an empty grave, and mankind has not been able to explain how it became empty. So we're going to be just like with the Agent X, we're going to be detectives. We're going to put on our detective hats and get our magnifying glasses out, and we're going to figure out how the grave got to be empty. But to start with, we should talk to an expert in solving cold case mysteries. So this is my friend. His name is J. Warner Wallace. Detective J. Warner Wallace worked in LA for some 30 years or something. And he was a very famous cold case detective. He was so famous, he's been on 60 Minutes, 48 Hours. And he's the guy who found all these murders that had happened 20 years ago. And almost everybody had died. The parents of the girl who had been murdered was dead. The uncles were dead. And he went back and he got the box of evidence, old evidence, and he went through it and he found the murder. Turns out one of those murderers was a guy in Silicon Valley. And he figured out how the guy killed the woman, because all they had was photographs of the dead body and all that. He figured out how he and where he got the tools to make the weapon, and all. He figured all that out. He's really, really very good at what he does. Well, he told me that there are two types of evidence that we have. One is direct evidence, and the other one is circumstantial evidence. A lot of people say, oh, that's just circumstantial evidence. Well, it turns out circumstantial evidence is very important. Let me tell you the difference between the two. Okay, so direct evidence is evidence that supports the truth of an assertion directly, that is, without any need for any additional evidence or inference. Like, for instance, you see someone running away from the scene of the crime, not even running away, you see someone shooting somebody else with a gun. You're like, hey, I am a witness to it. That's direct evidence. But we never seem to have much direct evidence because people don't go around killing people with an audience, right? They try to do it in private or when nobody's around. So we have to rely on circumstantial evidence. What is circumstantial evidence? Circumstantial evidence is evidence that relies on an inference to connect it to a conclusion of fact. For instance, forensic evidence, like a fingerprint of the scene of crime, or somebody says, I saw that guy running, 5 minutes after the shot. Or somebody says, well, that guy owed him money and he didn't want to pay it back, right? Things like that. Yeah. Now, here's what's interesting about direct evidence versus evidence. Most murder case convictions come from circumstantial evidence, right? And there he gave me some examples, like St. Connor Peterson, Mark Moxley, Lyle and Eric Menendez, right? And whenever people are freed, they're freed because of circumstantial evidence, like the case of Michael Morton, where the circumstantial evidence placed him somewhere else where he couldn't have committed a crime, right? So these are all cases where circumstantial evidence are very, very critical. And so we have to look at circumstantial evidence. Nobody's alive that was there 2,000 years ago. So we're going to have to look at circumstantial evidence. And that's what we're going to do. Okay? Are we ready? Okay.
Yes.
So first of all, let's go back to the empty grave. The first thing people are going to ask is, well, how do you know the grave is empty? I mean, I can't just assume the grave is empty. Well, let me ask you this. If the grave wasn't empty, if the body of Christ was still in the grave, how long would the story of Jesus' resurrection have lasted? Remember, the fundamental crux of Christianity was not the teachings of Jesus, was it? It was not like Jesus could teach everybody and then die like Muhammad or somebody else or Buddha or whatever. He had to be proved that the fundamental teachings of Jesus was, I am God, you will rise from the dead because I am going to rise from the dead. I will pay for your sins and rise from the dead. I am God. This is the evidence, right? So remember the slide. It says if there is no resurrection of the dead, and Christ did not rise from the dead, and our faith is in vain, our people are all too pity. In other words, if Jesus is not Christ from the dead, Jesus is deluded fools, right? So it is a very crux of Christianity. So Jesus could not be in the grave. That's number one. But here's the second thing. Let me ask you this. Let's say it's AD 33, 3 months after Jesus has been crucified, right? And you want to stop the religion of Christianity, right? The Christians are running around, they're saying Jesus is risen from the dead. What would be the easiest thing for you to do to kill the whole stupid religion? You would just go dig up, remember, it was a grave, right? And their graves, the Jews didn't have graves underground. They put them in caves and they had a tomb, a sepulcher. Well, how would you end it? Well, you just drag people over and you'd show them the dead body of Jesus and say, well, there he is. So the grave had to be empty. But here's another thing. Here's another very interesting thing. The apostles were not preaching the story in Rome, a few thousand miles away. Where were they preaching the story about Jesus' resurrection? They started preaching the story 8 minutes away in the temple courtyard in downtown Jerusalem. Now remember, how big is Jerusalem? It's 3/4 of a mile, even smaller during Jesus' time. So how long does it take for you to walk from the temple to Jesus' tomb right outside the city? In fact,
20 minutes.
we see that is exactly what happens in Acts 2. Here's the first evangelistic talk by Peter in the temple courtyard. The very first sermon by Peter to thousands of people in downtown Jerusalem. See, what was happening was this is the day of Pentecost. Just like Yom Kippur, thousands and thousands of tourists, Jews from other countries had come for the day of Pentecost, and they were there in the temple courtyard, and Peter starts to preach. And what does he say? What is his message? His message is this. He says, God raised Jesus from the dead, bringing him from the agony of death, for God would not allow the Holy One to undergo decay. I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here to this day. What tomb is he talking about? The tomb that I went to 2,000 years later. David's tomb in downtown Jerusalem. Just like when I was there, there were lots and lots of Jews praying there from other countries, right? At Pentecost, they had all just gone to see David's tomb that day. And he says, I can confidently tell you that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here today. And then what does he say? But Christ was not abandoned to the grave, nor did his body see decay. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are witnesses to the fact. Now think about this. There's David's tomb in Jerusalem. There's Jesus' tomb. Where was it? Actually, it was closer than David's tomb. Jesus' tomb is closer to the temple than it was still outside the city at the time. It is closer than David's tomb. Now, let me ask you this. If somebody had come to you and said, hey, this guy that you really liked who died, you know, a lot of people like Chuck Norris, right? Chuck Norris, great Christian man, wonderful guy, kung fu master, you know, fought with, was friend with Bruce Lee, great guy, right? He just died a few days ago, maybe 3 days ago. Let's say somebody came and said, you know, hey, Chuck Norris, you know, he died 3 days ago. Yeah. Not 3 days ago, let's say 40 days ago, because Pentecost was 40 days later. He died 40 days ago. Yeah. Well, he rose again 3 days and his tomb is empty. You're like, yeah, right. No, his tomb is empty. Well, and he's buried 5 minutes away. You can go see the empty tomb if you want. Well, that day, how many people became Christians? 3,000 people became Christians that day, according to the count. 3,000. Don't you think that most of them would walk 5 minutes before they became Christians? They go, let me go check it out. And that day, 3,000 became Christians, and 3,000 were baptized there in the temple courtyard. Now, what you probably don't know is the temple had these washing fountains, these pools were surrounded them. Under the temple were these fountains, these streams that they would use to fill out the aquifers in the temple. And then they had constant running water into these temple fountains. And so 3,000 people could have been baptized within maybe 30 minutes. Because each one of these could baptize like People would just walk in, be baptized, and walk out again. And all these 3,000 people got baptized right then. Now, don't you think any of them went to the tomb? I would say most of them, except for the old people, right? So we know the tomb was empty. The question is never, was the tomb empty? The question is, how did it get to be empty? Because you're like, okay, so the tomb was empty, so they moved the body. And that's what we have to do. You see? See, but the other thing is you have to remember is Jews weren't into any sort of metaphysical hogwash about symbolic resurrection. So the Jews, the only real resurrection would be a physical resurrection. It wasn't some sort of spiritual resurrection. And so the body of Jesus could not be in the tomb. So how did the tomb become empty? Dr. Gary Habermas, a guy I've met a few times, is a great guy. He does a lot of research. He did a lot of research on the Shroud of Turin. If you ever get a chance to look up Habermas Shroud of Turin, he does a great presentation on it. He studied 30 years of German, French, and English critical scholarship relating to Jesus' resurrection. He amassed a list of 2,200 sources. He identified 12 facts which are considered historical by a large majority of skeptical and conservative experts. Okay, so these are people who believe in Jesus and people who don't believe in Jesus. They agreed on, a majority of them agreed with these 12 facts. Let me give you the 12 facts. One, they all agree that Jesus died by crucifixion. Tacitus tells us he died by crucifixion. So does Josephus. Two, Jesus was buried. They all agree he was buried. They believe that Jesus' death caused the disciples to despair and lose hope, believing that his life was ended. That the tomb was discovered to be empty just a few days later, as we just mentioned. That the disciples had experiences that they believed were little appearances of the risen Jesus. So these are all agreed by skeptics and Christian experts, okay? Number 6, the disciples were transformed from doubters, afraid to identify themselves with Jesus, to bold proclaimers of his death and resurrection. Number 7, this resurrection message was the center of preaching in the early church. Number 8, this message was especially proclaimed in Jerusalem, where Jesus died and was buried shortly before. Number 9, as a result of this preaching, the church was founded and grew. Number 10, Sunday became the day of worship. Number 11, James, the brother of Jesus, a skeptic, was converted to faith when he believed he saw the risen Jesus. He was then executed for his faith, as Josephus tells us. Paul, a persecutor of Christianity, was also converted by an experience which he likewise believed to be an experience of the resurrected Jesus. These 12 facts are agreed on by the majority of skeptics. So there's non-Christians and Christian experts and scholars in the first century Judaism. Okay, so these are the facts. Now, given all this, remember what I said, the key question is not, was the grave empty? We know the grave was empty. The question is, how did the grave become empty? And we have two ways for the grave to have become empty. One, it could have become empty by natural means, right? And the first thing most people think is, well, yeah, somebody moved the body. Okay, absolutely, you're 100% correct. Somebody could have moved the body. Let's see, look at that. And two, the next way is supernatural means, right? But we don't want to jump to the supernatural. We don't want to say, well, God did it, right? We want to start with the natural means. The supernatural means is probably the most improbable option, but we have to look at that, or we have to look at the others, right? Okay. So first, the most obvious natural means is the grave is empty because the disciples stole the body, right? They came in, they took the body of Jesus, and then they declared, oh, he's risen from the dead. First thing we should consider, right? Quite possible. Well, here's the problem. Well, this is not one of the minimal facts. It's referred to in the accounts, and it makes logical sense. The tomb was most probably guarded by Roman guards.
Yeah.
Now, some people say, well, it could have been guarded by Jewish guards, the temple guard. No, because why would they ask Pilate for the guard? They wanted a guard, and they could have done it on their own. But secondly, Jesus was a Jewish executed prisoner. His body was in a sense the property of Rome to deal with. So they go to Pilate and they say, we want to put a guard on it. Pilate says, okay, fine, you have your guard. So they go put a guard on it, and chances are they would put a seal. Well, who are the Roman guards? Well, the Roman guard would be a group of 16 men. They were professional killers. They were trained to protect whatever they had from an entire battalion. And the penalty for their failure was quite simple. They were killed. And the idea was you were going to guard, if he asked you to guard something, you guard something with your lives, because if you die in battle, you'll die heroically. If you lose your guard, you're going to die as a traitor, right? So they might as well, take care of business while they're there. Okay, so the way they would have done this, the way the Jewish guard, and Polybius tells us this, he was a historian, he says the way the guards would do it is they would stand, of the 16 of them, the first guard, the first 4 would guard the tomb. And this is just a representation of the tomb. The tomb was definitely in a cave. This just kind of shows it as a square box. But anyway, so the 4 guards would stand in front of the tomb, right? And then the other 12 would sleep in a semicircle or rest in a semicircle. And if they slept, they would sleep with their heads facing inward so that nobody could come from behind, from outside and beat up their heads, right? So they would sleep with their heads inward. The other thing that would happen is every 4 hours, the 4 guards would switch off with the next 4. So they get 4 hours on and then something like, 20 hours, 16 hours off, right? So they keep moving on and off that way. And so every one of them would be rested. They'd have lots of time in between, 12 hours of rest in between before their next shift, and they would move on like that, right? So let's imagine that we had the apostles, right? We've got the 12 apostles. They are fishermen, remember that, and they want to kill these guards and remove the body of Jesus. So they'd have to make a frontal assault. They'd have to dispatch with these first. Some of them were sleeping, some of them were relaxing, and they're not fixed to this location. They could walk around, right? So they'd have to make sure all of them were killed, and then they would have to make a frontal assault on these 4 who obviously would be ready for them, and then they would have to move the stone, grab the body of Jesus, right? Go through the sepulchre, grab the body of Jesus, and then race out with him and fight any leftover guards, right? So this is what they would have to do. Everybody following me so far? Now, who wants to bet on the apostles? Who wants? You've got fishermen on one side, trained killers on the other side. People killed many people. Which side? Who are you going to bet? Put place your bets on? Well, I would bet with the trained killers. But here's the death knell for the whole story. The death knell for the whole story is if you look at the faith of the apostles, right? Peter was crucified upside down. Andrew was crucified. Simon was crucified. The first James was beheaded. The second James was sawed alive in pieces. Bartholomew was flayed alive in knives. Thomas came to India and was speared there. Jude was killed by arrows. Matthew was killed in Ethiopia. And Philip was killed in Aeropolis. In addition, 2 other potential plotters. James, the brother of Jesus, was stoned to death. Paul, the spread of the gospel, first hated the Christians, then became one and was executed in Rome for it. The only person who didn't die by execution or murder or assassination was John, and he spent many years in exile. Now, let me ask you, what sort of imbecilical idiot would concoct a lie and then die gruesomely for it, all the while maintaining that it was true? I mean, many people died for lies that somebody else told, like the 9/11 hijackers died for a lie that Osama bin Laden or Muhammad told, right? But who dies for a lie that they make up themselves? And so if you think about it, it's like this. Okay, so Peter, right after the crucifixion, Peter says, okay, so here's the plan. We fight the guards, get the body of the tomb out of the tomb and stash it somewhere. And then we come back and tell a story that will probably have us hunted, hated, whipped, stoned, poor, powerless, and finally get us all killed, and we never change our minds. So who's with me on this? Once you think of that, you go, wait a minute. No, there's no way. The only reason that these people were killed is because they claimed that Jesus was God and rose from the dead, and they were supposed to bring the message of love and peace to everybody. Why would you do that if it was a lie? Nobody was out to kill them because they claimed Jesus said we should love everybody, part of their message. They were killed by the Jews for claiming Jesus was God, and they were killed by the Romans for claiming Caesar was not God, but Jesus was. And they were killed by the people in India and all the other cultures because they claimed Jesus was the only way. And not one of the disciples ever recanted the story. And all of them could have lived if they had just been willing to recant. So now let's go back to those minimal facts. If you look at these 4 minimal facts, you will see that they contradict the empty tomb being stolen, being made empty by the stolen, right? The disciples experienced the risen Jesus. The disciples were transformed from doubters to believers. James, the brother of Jesus, skeptic, was converted and died for the faith. Paul was also converted by experience, and then he died for that, right?
Yeah.
So these are the minimal facts that show that the stolen theory does not work. Okay, so stolen theory does not work. What's the next possibility? Well, it could be that they went to the wrong tomb. So maybe they didn't steal the body, but maybe they were just mistaken and went to the wrong tomb. Now, you have to understand how these tombs were done, right? Right outside the old city wall was a mountain. This is called Golgotha. That's where we get the word Calvary, right? I always tease my Calvary Chapel friends because Calvary means skull, Calvarium, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, if you go to Calvary Chapel, you go to a skull chapel, right? But anyway, but the point being that is this thing looked like a skull, looked like a calvarium, but on the other side of it were a bunch of rock and caves. And so what people had done is they had carved tombs into it. So all the rich people owned tombs in this area. So to be fair, yes, they could have gone to the wrong tomb. But here's the problem with that. If they went to the wrong tomb, then when they buried Jesus, they forgot which tomb they buried him in, right? And then not only did the women the next day go to the wrong tomb, but then John and Peter went to the wrong tomb. And then the Pharisees to check out the tomb to say, hey, they stole the, because remember, the Pharisees say they stole the body of Jesus. So they must have gone and checked out the wrong tomb. Remember, even the Pharisees claimed the body of Jesus was not in the tomb, right? Followed by the Romans who went to the wrong tomb because they were like, hey, why did our Roman guard not guard the tomb? They need to go to, they need to be killed. And guess what? So what happens is the Sanhedrin goes to Pilate and says, look, the body's not there. We don't want you to talk to the Roman guard. Why? Because they will tell you the true story that something supernatural happened. So we're going to pay them to say that the disciples stole the body, but you better not kill them, because if you kill them, you remember, a Roman guard cannot be executed without a full trial. Mm. So the Sanhedrin doesn't want the Romans to have a full trial, because then guess what? The Romans guard are going to say, hey, something happened that night. There was a huge angel or something, and they don't want that to come out. So they're like, no, we're going to pay them. And then they pay Pilate, because Pilate also wants money, right? So they pay Pilate and they pay the guard, and everybody gets paid, and the story goes away, right? Yeah. But the question is, couldn't they have gone to the wrong tomb? But one, they're not going to pay everybody if it's the wrong tomb. They would just have the right body, right? But secondly, Joseph of Arimathea owns the tomb. That's his tomb. He's a rich man. He owns one of those tombs. Do you not think he would know which was his own tomb? And he's a Christian. He becomes a Christian, right? So he would know that. So the wrong tomb just doesn't work at all. In fact, the whole theory just doesn't work. Okay. So, and if it was the wrong tomb, eventually the Romans and the Pharisees would have figured out it was the wrong tomb, and they would have told the Christians, hey, yeah, the body's really here, end of the religion, here's the body, put the body in a cart, cart it down Main Street, and that would be the end of that. So the wrong tomb is revealed by these minimal facts. I'm not going to go over them, but we're all right there. Okay. Now, let's talk about the next theory. Maybe the tomb was empty because the body was moved by the Jews or the Romans. Mm-hmm. Right? But we've already answered this. Because if the body had been moved by the Jews and the Romans, they would have said, hey, we moved the body, end of Christianity. The Sanhedrin wanted to stop the Christians, right? The politicians, Sanhedrin were the politicians, they wanted to stop the Christians. They didn't want the Christians doing all that. They didn't want to dilute their power. Because remember, the Sanhedrin hated Jesus because he diluted their power. Mm-hmm. They would have proved the body, and that would have been the end of that. So the wrong tomb doesn't work. So what's the next possibility? And by the way, moved by the Romans doesn't work, and that's refuted by a number of different minimal facts. Okay, the next possibility is hallucination, right? Maybe Peter hallucinated, John hallucinated, the rest of the 11 hallucinated, all the Marys hallucinated. It makes you think you're back in the 60s where everybody's getting stoned, right? The problem is that more than 500 people saw Jesus after he had risen. And psychologists tell us that even if 2 people see the exact same thing, it isn't a hallucination, we get about 500 witnesses, right? And remember, this wasn't some strange bright light in the sky or mole on a tower, right, that resembled Jesus. These people claimed they had seen Jesus, they had touched him, they'd spent 40 days with him, remember?
Yeah.
He had come back after his resurrection, and they'd spent 40 days watching him eating and drinking, and they'd spend time with him. Right? Thomas touches his body.
Oh.
So, and Thomas goes and dies for that, right? So, the next possibility, and the Limon facts is refuted by those 3 points. Okay, the next possible theory is what I call the twin theory, and it's mockingly called the Day theory, the twin theory. It's called Day because there was a great debater, William Lane Craig, was debating with an expert, philosopher Robert Greg Cavan, who was an expert in this topic. And he came up with this theory, the twin theory, which makes sense. And William Lane Craig was mocking it after the movie Dave. See, around that time, there was a movie named Dave, and Dave looks just like the president, and the president's an evil conservative, Hollywood. And so Dave shows up and is a good liberal president. And because they look identical, the president gets sick, Dave pretends to be the president, and everybody's happy, right? Okay, so that's the story. Well, he called it the Dave movie. And so let me tell you what the theory is. Now, there is a problem with the twin theory, right? Because if Jesus was a twin, then his mother would have known that he was a twin. And he would have known that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, but his twin was there. But if Jesus was a twin, everybody in Nazareth would have known that he was a twin, because they would say, oh, that's one of the twin brothers. And not only that, Peter and James and John would know that he was a twin, and so they wouldn't go to die for the fact that a twin took the place of somebody else. So the only way the twin theory works is if somehow he could get swapped with somebody else's twin, and nobody knew that he had a twin brother. So this is the theory. So Jesus was born in a dark cave, they say. Now that's not necessarily true. He was born in a stable, which didn't have to be a cave. It would just be the bottom of a house. A lot of people think, oh, he was born. Remember, the way the Jews had their house is the bottom layer was the stable, and the top of the house is where they lived. Right? So he would have gone on the bottom underneath the main house because there was no room in the main house in the end. And so he would have been without the cows. No. So Greg Cavan's theory is that he was in the stable and it was very dark, and there was another couple there. But this couple had twins. And just for fun, I named them Jeter and Dieter. So what happened is somehow in the dark of the cave, Jesus, the real Jesus, got swapped with Dieter. Got it so far? So somehow, Mary's changing these, Jesus maybe washing him, and then the other mom comes over and puts her baby down, and then Mary comes back and picks up the wrong baby, and then the other mother picks up the wrong baby, and so now Jesus, the real Jesus, goes home with a guy named Jeter, and they think they are twins. But meanwhile, the real twin named Dieter goes to Nazareth. Well, first goes to Jerusalem, and then, goes to Egypt, and then comes back to Nazareth, lives in Nazareth, thinking he is the son of Joseph, or the son of Mary, with a stepfather, Joseph. Everybody got me so far? This is the theory. Well, this happens, this goes on, and then one day in 33 AD, Dieter and Jesus are walking down the street. And this is Dieter, who got swapped with Jesus' birth, and he thinks his name is Jesus, and he was claiming he was God, and he dies on the cross. Well, this is the real Jesus, who thinks his name is Jeter, and he looks nothing like his supposed twin brother with his Jeter, right? Which is Jeter over here. So now Jeter notices that the man on the cross looks just like him. So the real Jesus and Jeter decide that they will pretend that his name is Jesus, and he will be the risen God, the risen Jesus from the dead. Everybody following me on this? This is his theory, okay?
It's
Because the
very
only way the theory would
interesting.
work is if nobody knows he has a twin brother. And the people who do know he has a twin brother are part of the plot and are not going to die for their sins, what they did. So, now this Dieter guy, first of all, they have to steal the body somehow. We haven't explained that. He doesn't explain how they get rid of the old body, right? But somehow they get rid of the body, they empty the tomb, and then they pretend that Dieter pretends he's Jesus. Now, there's a problem with this. First of all, if you had a son who was a twin and you didn't know he was a twin, and one day he died and suddenly he showed up again, would you know the difference? Mothers of twins have said, yeah, absolutely. Even if they were identical, I know my two twins apart. I mean, I would know one twin from the other. So if I had one son who grew up, he wasn't even if he was an adopted twin, I would know that, but I would know him so well that if his other twin showed up, I would know the difference.
Yeah.
Right? But then here's the other problem. How does Jeter know who Mary is? How does he know? He says, hi, you must be Martha. No, I'm Mary, your mother. Oh, you must be James. No, I'm Jude, your brother. Oh, you must be Peter. No, I'm John. He doesn't know who anybody is. Right? How does he know who everybody is? It's not like they're advertising who they are. And he doesn't know the teaching unless he was following the teaching of Jesus the whole time, but he was disguised. So nobody said, hey, you look just like Jesus. If you're interested, there's a debate about this whole thing with William Lane Craig, who demolishes this argument completely. And by the way, the most memorable facts are quite simple. If you think about it, James then becomes what? He becomes the believer, a brother of Jesus. He was a skeptic. He converts to the faith when he saw the risen Jesus. And then he dies for that claim, right? So obviously, you would know if this guy was somebody who looked like your brother, but was not your brother, because James would say, hey, remember when we did this? And the guy would go, yeah. And James was like, I was kidding. We never did that. You're fake. So the Dave theory just doesn't work. Okay. So let's go to the last natural theory. Some people have this other theory. It's called the swoon theory. Maybe Jesus was not dead. Maybe he just fainted or somebody gave him a drug. So everybody thought he was dead. Like Romeo and Juliet. I mean, the Romans, they said they didn't really know enough about medicine. Maybe Jesus was just taking a coma drug. Some guy even wrote a book claiming that this is what happened. He called it the Passover plot.
Really?
The sad thing is that most people never bother to learn the details about what could happen and what couldn't have happened. So let's first talk about crucifixion. So before the whole thing happened, we have the Last Supper, and Jesus said, this is my blood poured out for you for the forgiveness of sin. And then he goes into the Garden of Gethsemane, right? And and Luke says that Jesus, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground, right? Now, some people say, oh, Luke was just trying to make it sound intense. But the reality is that this is a real affliction. This is called hematidrosis. Hematidrosis is an affliction associated with high psychological stress. If you're really, really stressed, what happens is severe anxiety causes the release of internal chemicals that break down the capillaries in the sweat glands. And as a result, you bleed into the glands. And when you sweat, the sweat comes out tinged with blood, as you can see in these pictures. It's a real medical condition, right? And this sadly has the unfortunate effect of making the skin extremely fragile, so the skin becomes very sensitive and tender, and at times even painful to touch. Jesus was in great mental anguish, and at that moment he suffered from hematidrosis. And this is even more heartbreaking in that the next day, Jesus was to experience 39 lashes with the skin already in this ready to bleed state. See, history tells us that the Roman 39 lashes were from a whip with a braided leather thongs and metal balls and bone woven into them. When the whip would strike the flesh, these balls would cause deep bruises and the bone would cut the flesh severely. If the soldier doing the whipping was an extra foul move, the cuts and the intensity of the whipping could shred the back so much that the spine of the victim was sometimes exposed. The whipping would have gone all the way down the shoulders to the back, to the butt, and the back of the legs, and it was just terrible. One physician who has studied Roman beatings said, as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. Eusebius, the 3rd century historian, says, the sufferer's veins were laid bare, and the very muscles, sinews, and bowels of the victim were open to exposure. Isaiah 53:5 says, he was beaten for our transgressions, and by his stripes we are healed. This was written 700 years before Christ. Now, the result of all of this, the hypovolemic shock, the hematidrosis and the beating, is he goes into something called hypovolemic shock. What is hypovolemic shock? Well, hypovolemic shock is what happens when you lose a large amount of blood. This does 4 things. First, our heart races to try and pump blood that is in there. 2, blood pressure drops, causing fainting and collapsing. 3, the kidney stops producing urine to try and maintain what liquid is left in the body. And 4, the person becomes extremely thirsty as the body craves fluids to replace the lost blood volume. Psalm 22:15 says, my strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. Written 900 years before Christ. Now, you recall what happens on the way to the cross. Jesus stumbles to this cross, right? And he faints, and Simon the Cyrene is forced to carry the cross. Why? Because he suffered from hypovolemic shock, and he can't handle the weight of the cross. Then later, as he's hanging on the cross, Jesus says, what he says? After this, Jesus said, I thirst. A very clear indication that he was in hypovolemic shock. Now, when Jesus gets to Golgotha, to Calvarium, the place where he should be crucified, the soldiers tied his arms and legs to the cross and then nailed them. Now, a lot of people think they were nailed to the palms, right? But if you nail to the palms, your hands are not going to stay up in the nails, because they'll just rip right through your skin in your hand. So what they did is they actually nailed them through the median nerve, which is right here where my index finger is. And what happens is there's a bunch of bones there that can actually hold the nail, and it would allow the nail to hold up the body, right? Well, if we've done some analysis on crucified victims, and we found that this is the exact spot where the nails would have been done. This is a study done by a medical doctor who studied crucified victims and studied the whole skeletal structure and where things were bent. So what this happens when you nail to this wrist, it does another thing. Remember your funny bone, right? How does it feel when you hit it? Well, the median nerve here in your wrist is more sensitive than the funny bone because it carries all the important senses for your fingers. You know, your fingers are so you can touch and feel things. Well, all those senses have to go through this median nerve that tells your whole body how you're feeling and how to move, you manipulate your digits. Well, that is so sensitive. And then the Romans knew, they didn't know that that was necessarily what the finger's nerves went through, but they knew that that nerve caused a lot of pain. Don't ask how they knew it. Well, okay, by testing it out on people and seeing what caused the most pain on people. Well, what they did was they put the nail right through the median nerve, which is the equivalent of taking a pair of pliers and squeezing your ulnar nerve, which is your funny bone nerve, which causes intense pain. And this pain would last until that nerve was torn to shreds and you finally stop feeling your fingers. The pain was so unbearable that they created a brand new word for this pain, and that word is excruciating. It means out of the cross. Christ suffered for our transgressions. And then they do the same thing with his other hand and then his feet. Archaeologists studying crucified victims found that the bones of the crucified victims would be put through the heel. And they found a crucified victim, and this is one of them. He had been buried by his family. His body had been given back to his family. And one thing they noticed was that there was a nail, and the nail was right through the heel. And they couldn't get the nail out because it was so embedded in the heel. They obviously tried, right? So Jesus would have had a nail pierced right through his heel. Let me ask you this. Did this remind you of something? How about the proto-evangelium? And you will strike his heel. Satan will strike his heel. And then another prophecy, Psalm 22:16, they have pierced my hands and my feet.
Right.
Did you know that crucifixion had not been written when the psalm was written 900 years earlier? It was not. Romans were not even around at the time. Now, people didn't die easy from crucifixion. They were meant to. They were meant to suffer terribly and then die. They were meant to be an example to others. The Romans didn't want you to die on the cross right away. They wanted you to suffer. So everybody that walked by you would see you suffering and say, I will never fight against Romans. I will never rebel against Romans. I will never do anything against them.
Right.
Well, how would they do that? Well, they'd have to keep the person alive as long as possible. So what we know from what they would do, when Jesus' wrists were nailed, as we know from archaeological finds of crucifixion victims, his arms would have been pulled back and his shoulders dislocated. And this, by the way, is another part of the prophecy, Psalm 22:14, that says what? My bones are out of joint. So then they raise the cross and they drop it in a stand. And once the cross was back down in a stand, he would be hanging vertically. The weight of his body and the position of his arm would make him fall forward and put great stress on his diaphragm. And his chest would be in an inhaled position like this. So to breathe, Jesus would have to exhale. To exhale, he would have to push up on his feet with the nail in it, causing great pain. And he couldn't use his arms to pull himself up. Why? Because his arms were dislocated. And each time he would be pushing himself up, and finally with the pressure on his chest ease, he would be able to exhale. But then the strain, so he has to push himself up on his knee, and then the pain in his foot and through that bone, and then on the pain in his chest, he would, and all the pressure on his torn on that median nerve, because he's still pulling on it, he just can't use it to do anything. He would then exhale, and then he would drop down again. And then he would have to do it again and again every time he needed to breathe. Now, people could last days like this, intense pain, constantly trying to breathe. But if you recall, the soldiers came by because the next day was the Sabbath. And the Jews had said, we don't want people hanging on the Sabbath. So the soldiers came back, and what did they do to the two thieves? They broke their legs. Why do you think they broke their legs? Because if you break their legs, they can't push up to breathe. And what did they do? They suffocate to death. But when they came to Jesus, they didn't break his legs because they said he was already dead. Now, some people say, well, maybe he wasn't dead and that's how he got away from it. They cheated. Well, no, because remember, to breathe, you have to push yourself up and release the pressure on your chest. And they would have known he was doing that because he couldn't get away with pretending, not to do it, breathing without it, right? So they would have known. So the minute he stops this large muscle movement, guess what happens? You die of suffocation, right? Now, could you fall in the coma? Remember, the theory is he swooned. If you swoon on the cross, what happens to you? You die of suffocation. If you go into a coma on the cross, what happens to you? You die of suffocation. There is no Romeo and Juliet story part of this, right?
No.
So then how did he die? Did he die of suffocation? Because he was already dead when they got to him. Well, an analysis by a medical doctor indicates that at this point, if you had hematidrosis, you went through hypovolemic shock, and you're crucified, what happens to you is your blood goes into some sort of shock, right? It can't clot up, it can't stop bleeding, nothing stops the flow of blood, and guess what happens from his back and all the beating? What happens? He continues to bleed, and the Lord dies of the massive blood loss as his blood pours completely out of his body. Isaiah 53:6 says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid upon him the sin of us all. Jesus was dead. And darkness covered the land. In Luke's gospel, it says it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness all over the earth until the 9th hour, and the sun was darkened. And Matthew says, then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked and the rocks were split. And you know, the temple veil was this thick, huge curtain. It was probably about, you know, it had layers and layers and layers and layers, at least a foot or 2 foot thick. And yet it was torn from the top to the bottom, opening the Holy of Holies. And the earth quaked. Now, this is a fulfillment of the prophecy. Joel 2:31-32 says, written 500 years before Christ, says, the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood for the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. For on Mount Zion and Jerusalem there will be deliverance. But you say, Neil, well, there was an eclipse and the sun turned to darkness. We should be able to figure it out scientifically, shouldn't we? Yeah, but if you look at the astronomical charts, you can see that there is no way that there was an eclipse of the sun around the time. Right? Well, okay. An atheist website is right. See, this is all fake. There was no sun turning to darkness and the moon turning to blood. There was no eclipse. Well, yeah, there was no eclipse. But is that the only thing that can darken the sky? It turns out that the atheist is wrong. You see, the historian Fleetner Trillenius, right, who lived between 117 to 138 AD, records for us an event that happened before his lifetime, a few years after the 202nd Olympiad. It says, in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, AD 33, a failure of the sun took place greater than any previously known, and the night came on at the 6th hour of the day. Now, that was noon because they started their morning, our 6 p.m. a.m. would be the first hour, right? So the stars actually appeared in the sky, and a great earthquake took place in Bithynia and overthrew a greater part of Nicaea. So there is evidence that the prophecy was true and what Luke and Matthew say was true, without having to appeal to a signal Christian. This is a non-Christian, having nothing to do with the crucifixion, nothing to do with anything about Christianity, tells us that this happened. Jesus was dead. Roman historians tell us that no less than 4 executioners had to confirm the death of a crucified criminal. And as we've just seen, the Romans were very intimate with every form of death. They were experts in torturing and prolonging death, and they were experts in killing. Furthermore, if a crucified person were to show up alive a few days later, the Roman executioner would be executed himself. So I don't think they were in the habit of making mistakes. They would make sure Jesus was really dead once he came off the cross, right? So how would they make sure? One of the ways they make sure is that it says the Roman centurion, pierces Jesus' side with a spear. And what happens? He reports that blood and water gushes out. Well, not knowing anything else with this fact, a doctor can tell you immediately that this person was dead. Why? The technical reason? The heart has stopped, which results in the collection of fluid in the membrane around the heart, called pericardial effusion, as well as collection of fluid around the lungs, which is called pleural effusion. This can't happen if the heart is beating, right? Because you see, if you see pericardial effusion, you know the person is dead. And so it's a very waxy, thick looking liquid. And what happens is when you get blood, it also separates, right? If blood is sitting for a while and not being pumped, it will separate from the plasma. And you get this very waxy looking liquid. And this is what Psalm 22:14 says, written 900 years before Christ. My heart is like wax. It's melted in the midst of my bowels. Mm-hmm. But given all of that, the death blow to this theory, right, that Jesus didn't die but swooned, comes from an atheist, an opponent of Christianity. Dr. David Strauss says this. He says, it is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, that's the tomb, who crept about weak and ill, wanting mental treatment, who required bandaging and strengthening and indulgence, could have given to the disciples the impression that he was conqueror over death and the grave and the Prince of Life. An impression which lay at the bottom of their future ministry. Think about this. These disciples were going to go all throughout the world and they were going to die for their faith. If Jesus had survived the crucifixion, somehow woke up in the cool of the tomb, pushed aside the heavy tomb, the stone, fought up the Romans or whatever, or hobbled into town with a nail hole in his both his heels, nails through his arms, dislocated shoulders, right? The disciples wouldn't say, he's God. They would say, oh, get a doctor. And they would not have thought that he was risen from the dead. They would have just thought that he had survived a crucifixion. Josephus tells us that the historian Josephus, being a Jew, when he joined the Romans, he found out the Romans had crucified 3 of his friends. He immediately went and got permission to take them off the cross to try and save their lives. 2 of them died. Despite everything they could do after they took them off the cross, they still died. The other one survived for a few years, but he was never the same, and he died a few years later from the crucifixion. Now, here's the other thing you have to remember. This wasn't just an empty tomb. The disciples said they'd seen him, they'd touched him, they'd watched him eat, and they saw him ascend into heaven. And then they died for that personal claim.
Yeah.
In fact, the actual disciples of the disciples, I remember last time we talked about how the apostles had apostles, and I mentioned that Clement of Rome, one of Peter's disciples, says twice in his writings that Peter personally told him that Christ had risen. And similarly, Polycarp, a personal disciple of John, said John had reiterated 6 times to him that he had seen Christ risen from the dead. It was a personal crime. John says, no, I saw it. And he kept saying that, I saw it. And not to mention that the minimal facts refute the swoon theory, which is that Jesus died by crucifixion. He didn't swoon. The disciples had experience where they believed it was a literal experience of the risen Jesus. The disciples were transformed from doubters afraid to identify themselves with Jesus to bold proclaimers of the death and resurrection, not, oh, he survived the crucifixion. And this completely destroys the swoon theory. So now that we're eliminating all the natural means, and you can come up, usually when I do this with kids, we take 2 weeks to go through this. And after week 1, we introduce the minimal facts. And then the beginning of week 2, the kids have to get together and come up with a theory of how the grave came to be empty that meets all the minimal facts. And then the other teams can tell them why their idea doesn't work. So they have a competition. And every time we've done that, nobody has ever been able to explain all the minimal facts and explain how the body came with it. Even aliens don't work, because then you're like, well, why would an alien care about coming back from the dead and proclaiming that he was God? Right? And then leaving. So what have we established already, right? We've established it's more rational to think that God exists using science, that there are up to 6 supernatural dimensions using science, that Jesus existed using history, and the minimal facts are true using history and archaeology. Now, given all this, right, and the elimination of all possible solutions, we're left with only one option. What's that? None of these works. The resurrection happens supernaturally. He is risen indeed. The creator of the entire universe came down in love to die for us. And if you think about it, folks, if God can create a universe, creating matter and energy and time out of nothing, then raising himself from the dead is an easy task, but only a God could do it. If the probable is impossible, then the improbable must be possible. Christianity isn't a blind faith. It's a rational faith built on a solid historical and logical foundation. You see, folks, the grave was empty because Jesus Christ really rose from the dead. He is risen indeed. And not only the disciples claimed that he had risen, but over 500 people saw him, including a Pharisee who was first trying to kill all the Christians, who was called Paul. That would be like Hitler meeting God and becoming the sanest and most humanitarian Jew for the rest of his life and dying preaching that Judaism was true. You see, something happened that day in 30 AD that has changed the world forever, and anyone who has studied the evidence forever. Jesus said, I am God, and I will prove to you by dying. I'll prove this to you by dying and rising from the dead. By doing something that can't be faked, that can't be done by anyone else, he proved he was really God. If he was God, then that makes what he said very important, doesn't it? He also said that people who don't believe in him will not be in heaven because they don't want to spend eternity in the presence of a God they do not like. In addition, if he's the creator who created us to glorify him, we will never find a purpose or satisfaction in our life until we accept him as our Lord and Savior and live for him. You see, the central gospel message that Jesus preached is that we have all abandoned God and rejected him and rebelled against him. We are sinners, and what we deserve from God is punishment and death. But Jesus saves us from that punishment by taking our punishment upon himself on that cross, so we don't have to be separated from God. And for you to find peace and purpose in your life, you're going to have to accept his payment for you and make him your Lord and Savior.
Amen.
My question is, have you lost a loved one? And when they died, was that the end of their life, the end of their dreams, the end of your dreams with them? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then our faith is in vain, and we of all people are to be pitied. But that verse goes on to say this. It says, but Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And what does that mean? It means that death is not the end game. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That is a lot of I never see like so detailed about the empty tomb that a lot of different theories, even the twin one. So funny. And could be a good activity for the kids to
Yeah, find a room to
inspire.
get to do. In fact, if you guys want to try it, take it. I'll email you the minimal facts, and you guys can play around with it. Find a reason from the minimal facts. Find a way the tomb could have gotten empty using the minimal facts.
Yeah, yeah. Send me the.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Okay, it's anybody want to asking question? You guys are so quiet.
Too much data.
Well, I usually will have a short clip in the small portion, some important, and then make a promotion, or that people who don't have time to see the whole thing, then the small portion can, attract them to see, wow, we never thought about that. Yeah. Okay, if nobody have a question, we're gonna end it here. And thanks again for everybody to spend night with us.
Thank you. See you guys. Talk to you next week.
Talk to you next week. Have a good night.